everyone. In this video, we're going to build some cells. So finally, after much chemistry, we're moving on to cell structure and function. Cells, if you recall, are the smallest living units in the human body. They actually are the building blocks for all plants and animals. And each cell may perform some functions independently, including maintenance of its own homeostasis. So there are two general classifications of cells. The first is sex cells, alternatively referred to as germ cells or reproductive cells. This is the sperm and the oocyte, which is the egg, but oocyte is the more proper way of describing it. And then everything else is considered a somatic cell. So somatic cells are body cells. And the reason we make this distinction is that everything about how the cells replicate and what they're able to do and what their purposes are differ based upon whether it is a sex cell or a somatic cell. So in this collection of videos, we're only going to consider the somatic cells. The somatic cells, there are so many types of somatic cells, but the somatic cells have some important commonalities that allow us to consider them as one grouping. And then when we cover the reproductive system, we will cover the formation and the purposes of the sex cells. Okay, so what we're going to do is just draw a quick little cell with some basic structures that we want to take a look at and just sort of highlight the major components of the cell. So the cell is surrounded by a cell membrane, and we're going to spend a whole video talking just about the structure and the functions of the cell membrane. And inside of the cell, we have a nucleus, which is kind of like the brain of the cell. It also contains the DNA and the RNA and is responsible for making sure that the cell is maintained. If something is broken, it can generate the instructions or the materials to fix the cell. And then also it sort of governs the reproduction of the cell when it comes time. There are also many organelles inside of the cell. Organelles are kind of like little organs, so they have all very important purposes. And with those, we'll spend another video talking just about all the different types of organelles. One thing that's important to note is that not all of the organelles are present in all of the cells, but there are a certain group of organelles that are present in most cells that are really important to maintenance of the structures of the cell, as well as utilization of glucose for making ATP. Inside of the cell, surrounding the nucleus and sort of in between all the organelles, is also a liquid called cytosol. And collectively, cytosol and organelles are referred to by the umbrella term cytoplasm. One other thing about cells is they're actually surrounded by fluid or bathed in fluid. And we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of fluid that we see sort of in cells and around cells and what their specific properties are. Now, so what we're drawing here is kind of like a model cell, and we're going to spend the next couple of videos considering the model cell, meaning the cell that has a generally spherical shape and has all of the possible organelles that any cell could contain. And then as we move through the different body systems, we'll draw the structures of the cells that belong to that body system, and we'll specify which organelles may be absent or may be present, and what organelles are especially important for that particular body system's functioning. So in terms of keeping with the chemistry, it's important to note that cells are made up of all of the organic molecules that we discussed. So lipids make up the cell membrane, which is responsible for separating the internal environment of the cell from the external environment. Proteins, which are responsible for creating the framework of the cell. Cells have like a scaffolding to sort of help keep their shape and help different molecules move around inside of the cells. They also make up many enzymes and actually many other things that we'll get into. Carbohydrates are largely responsible for production of energy. And nucleic acids are responsible for the synthesis of cell proteins. So let's take a few moments and consider the cytosol and how it differs from what is outside of the cell. So we like to think of three general bodies of fluid inside of the body. And technically speaking, there will be a couple of others that we'll address later on, but overwhelmingly, it will be easy enough to just consider these three. Inside of the cell is considered intracellular space, and outside of the cell is considered extracellular space. And contained within the extracellular space is fluid that surrounds the cells, as well as blood vessels. So we can actually refer to the fluid inside of blood vessels as intravascular fluid. It's also blood, but for the sake of making a comparison at this point in time, we'll refer to it as intravascular. And then we refer to the fluid that's between the blood vessels and the cells. So just surrounding the cells, but separating the cells from the blood vessels. We call that fluid interstitial fluid. So intracellular fluid, the fluid inside of the cell, is abbreviated ICF and is also called cytosol, which is how we referred to it initially. The intracellular fluid contains water, it contains many ions. So remember, when we think of our ionic bonds and we think of them separating when they are placed in water, and then we have all of our ions, that's kind of how we get these ions here. We have a variety of soluble and insoluble proteins, and then some waste products that are generated by the cell. And that is just what's dissolved in the cytosol, and it is above and beyond the organelles, and then of course the nucleus. So in order for our cells to work, we need to think of them as exchanging stuff with the external environment, with the extracellular space. So an example would be oxygen needs to arrive to cells. So oxygen is going to travel through the blood, and then in order for it to get to the cell, it needs to pass out of the intravascular space, so out of the blood vessel and into the interstitial fluid, and then from there it can move into the inside of the cell, or the intracellular fluid. Or conversely, when we think of carbon dioxide is a waste product that's generated by the cell, and it wants to be eliminated via respiration. So we're going to exhale that CO2. In order for that to occur, the CO2 needs to move out of the cell and into the interstitial fluid, and then from the interstitial fluid into the intravascular fluid. And then from there, it can be transported elsewhere in the body. So we can start to see very early on the ways in which the blood vessels are a superhighway for everything that needs to get to the different types of cells, because the cells are everywhere and all of them need some of the same basic things, including oxygen and glucose. And similarly, when we want to excrete different things, the way that we can get rid of them is by transferring them into the intravascular volume and then moving them throughout the body via the blood vessels. Another point that's very critical is that the composition of the interstitial and the intravascular fluids are very, very similar to each other, but they are very different than the intracellular fluid. And what we're going to see as a result of this is that there's generally a free movement of stuff between the intravascular and the interstitial fluid because they are so similar, but what is allowed to go into and out of the cell is much more tightly controlled. And so in another video, we'll talk about the cell membrane and how exactly it regulates what's able to go into and out of the cell. We mentioned the different ions that are present in the intracellular fluid, and it's also important to note that they are present in the extracellular fluid as well, but in different relative concentrations. So we'll just take the kind of major ions that we need to remember, and we'll just spend a few minutes talking about this. So the first one is potassium. Potassium is very highly concentrated in the intracellular fluid. There's tons and tons and tons of potassium ions. And in the extracellular fluid, and I mean interstitial and intravascular, there is, in a relative proportion, much, much less potassium. Conversely, sodium is very highly concentrated in the extracellular fluid and minimally concentrated in the intracellular fluid. So these of all of them are probably the most important to remember. We're going to see sodium ions and potassium ions interact constantly with cells and all the different types of cells. And we mentioned in one of our videos that the cells are able to conduct electrical current, and that's how we have many different types of things such as neuromessaging, such as muscle contraction, action potential formation, just tons and tons of cell processes that are critical to the cells continuing to survive and to interact with other cells in the body. And so knowing that the potassium is highly concentrated inside of the cell and sodium more so on the outside of the cell is absolutely critical to understanding those processes. So there's a couple of silly jokes that could be utilized in order to remember this. And my favorite one is that all the ions are having a party inside of the cell, and potassium is invited, and it decides to go to the party. It says K, and the sodium is invited to the party, but it decides not to go. It says nah. So there's other ones. I know it's really silly, but it might help you remember, and maybe it'll just make you laugh, but it's so important to remember which one's which, because we need to have these ions move in and out and keep in mind which direction they're going and why. Okay, some other ions that are important. Chloride ions are present less inside of the cell and more highly concentrated outside of the cell. Calcium, again, less inside the cell, more outside the cell. And then one other thing that's a little bit unusual and probably is not mentioned a lot, but it's one of the things that contributes to negative charge inside of the cell, so I want to mention it here, is protein anions. So I'm going to just label them as PR-, but these are protein anions. So proteins that have a negative charge that are present in abundance inside of the cell in the intracellular fluid, but not present in the interstitial fluid. Now, different proteins are also present, different proteins, not the same ones, different proteins are also present in the intravascular volume, and the presence of the proteins in the intravascular volume and not in the interstitial is really the only major difference between the composition of the intravascular and the interstitial fluids. And we'll see later that the proteins that are present inside of the intravascular fluid help to maintain the intravascular volume. So one kind of protein inside the cell, different kinds of proteins in the intravascular, and no proteins in the interstitial. And so that's another thing that would be really, really good to remember. Okay, so that concludes our introduction to cell structure and function. And coming up, we're going to spend some time talking specifically about the cell membrane, structure and function of the cell membrane, structure and function of the different organelles that are present inside of the cell, and the nucleus, a little bit about the nucleus. And then we'll talk in grave detail about membrane transport, how we get stuff into and out of the cell. Those are pretty much the major topics. But that's all for now. Thanks for watching.